I'm Sasha Nicole.
And I'm Star.
And I'm Dr. T.
And this is American Therapy, the definitive podcast on all things Black mental health. And today, as always, we have a great show. We're extremely excited. So, Star, tell us, bring us in. What are we doing today?
Okay, y'all, so I have my fan on purpose because it is Pride Month, okay? So this month, we've been talking about all things justice and, Black people fighting for their freedom. And we have a whole segment of our own community that, Uncle Billy Porter called out, rightfully so. So we're going to talk about our LGBTQ family and their mental wellness and us as Black people. What do we need to do to support our entire community in this fight? So I think today we said, where do we go from here, embracing our LGBTQ family? And I apologize if I left off some letters. I'm learning. So
say plus. So let's do this because this is active. Don't say apologize, but just say plus. If you say plus, it acknowledges that there are other identities that you might not know of, and that might be created. So just add a plus.
I love it. We got you.
Absolutely. So we're going to go ahead, excuse me. We're going to go ahead and get started in with our guest today. First up, we have Zaria James, who was known as a cheer and dance world champion recipient, Top Gun All-Stars, college graduate of Johnson & Wales University in Hospitality Management and Tourism. She's also a National LGBTQ Task Force Winter Party Volunteer Relations Coordinator 2019 and 2020, Colors Under the Rainbow fundraiser, as well as a keynote speaker for FIU Transgender Day of Remembrance and a committee member of the Miami Beach Pride December 2019. Prior to transition, corporate endeavors included managing businesses such as Uber, Hilton, Marriott, Hertz, Kimpton, and now CEO of her own company, Zaria James LLC, which will consolidate all business endeavors. And then last but not least, we have David J. Johns, who is known for his passion, public policy acumen, and fierce advocacy for youth. He's an enthusiast about equity, leveraging his time, talent, and treasures to address the needs of individuals and communities often neglected and ignored. A recognized thought leader and social justice champion, David's career has focused on improving life outcomes and opportunities for Black people. On September 2017, David Johns began his next life chapter as the executive director of the National Black Justice Coalition, NBJC, excuse me, y'all, a civil rights organization dedicated to the empowerment of Black, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer people, LGBTQ, including people living with HIV/AIDS. NBJC's mission is to end racism, homophobia, and LGBTQ bias and stigma. In 2013, he was also appointed as the first executive director of the White House Initiative on Educational Excellence for African Americans by President Obama, and he served until the last day of Obama's administration in 2017, which is a really big deal. The initiative worked across federal agencies with partners at communities nationwide to produce a more effective continuum of education and workforce development programs for African American students of all ages. Prior to his White House appointment, he's been a senior education policy advisor to the Senate Committee on Health. Before working for the Senate, he served under the leadership of the late U.S. Senator Ted Kennedy. He also was a Congressional Black Caucus Foundation Fellow in the office of Congressman Charles Rangel. And Johns has worked on issues affecting low-income and minority students, neglected youth, early childhood education, and HBCUs. Among so many other things, we'll be including his bio. He has literally had a plethora of accomplishments, and we're so excited to have both of you on today. Thank you so much for joining us.
We got heavy hitters today. Woo! Good Lord.
Good space.
So let's get it started. As mentioned, David, you know, one of the things you pointed out in the very beginning was you said, don't apologize, but just make mention to acknowledge. And I think for me coming into this show, actually, I was pretty nervous because I find myself not on the side where I'm not advocating for our LGBTQ plus brothers and sisters, but where I feel as though, how do I become more informed so that I can best meet the needs of my brothers and sisters? Because what we often see is we have a lot of ignorance about the community. And then, as mentioned, with what's happening with the Black Lives Matter, our brothers and sisters in the LGBT community are feeling neglected, as though the anti-Blackness of, well, Black Lives Matter unless you're part of this community. So what are some ways that we can just jump right in and start to make sure that we're not only acknowledging, but that we're also showing up to support?
I appreciate that. I also appreciate the invitation to share space with Black women, cis and trans, right? So thank you for that. As a Black feminist, I want to name that. That's important. The direct answer to your question is to do exactly this, is to invite people to have conversations about things that we can learn more about. And as Black people, it's incredibly important for us to appreciate a few things. One is that as long as there have been Black people, even before the terms existed, there were Black people who engaged in what we now refer to as lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, pansexual, asexual, intersex, any of these things, right? And to be clear, I listed a bunch of terms that are often thought about under the umbrella of what it means to be queer, but those things are very different. And there's a whole lot of diversity both within and between them, right? And so I identify as a same-gender loving Black man. It's a new term to a lot of folks, and that's by design. It's by design because of the way that whiteness and anti-Blackness works in this country. So when most people think about Black people, they assume that all of us are straight, are heteronormative, because again, the way their privilege works, they also assume that all of us are cisgender. Few people even think about what it means to be trans or the privilege of being cis until they are introduced to a trans person, right? One of the things that happens as a result of that is that people assume that anyone who is queer is white, right? And so people like me and my sister Zaria get erased. Those of us who literally are in the middle of these otherwise assumed to be mutually exclusive circles are just thought to not exist, right? And so we tend to avoid having conversations about intra-communal stuff. This is Black people stuff, right? I tell people all the time, I don't lead a gay organization, I lead a civil rights organization. The National Black Justice Coalition is the nation's only and now longest serving civil rights organization that is at the intersections of racial justice and LGBTQIA equality. Now, when I say racial justice, I'm talking about equity, because not all of us face the same challenges. I'll give you an example, and then I'm going to yield the mic to Zaria, and we can come back to this. Just this week, the Supreme Court of the United States made a declaration that essentially says, you cannot fire someone, you cannot discriminate against someone based on actual or perceived sexual identity, gender orientation, or expression. And the reality is that there are a whole lot of Black folks right now who don't know what Title VII is, who don't know that the Supreme Court made a decision, who also don't understand why any of this is noteworthy. That's problematic. And here's why. I'm from Inglewood, California, born and raised. Both of my parents are from Austin, Texas. Before this week, if I could have put a picture on my desk at work of me and one of my friends, and if somebody assumed that that was my partner, I could have been fired, and they would have been legally protected. So this week, that's changed. The law has changed. The attitudes, the belief, the stigma, the ignorance, the phobia that would cause somebody to take a job from somebody who otherwise has earned it or deserves it or can function in that role has not changed overnight. And we should be clear about that. The point I'm making is that there are so many Black people who think that the struggles associated with the modern civil rights movement, protracted bus boycotts, and the things that we sort of celebrate sometimes now only in February, that those victories have been won. But there are members of our community who still cannot show up as they are without fearing being discriminated against or killed. And so while that is significant, it is still the reality that in Texas and in so many other states throughout the country, most of them where Black people live, which is where Black queer people live, right? We don't come out like white people do and move to neighborhoods like Hollywood, California, or Boys Town, Chicago, or Chelsea, New York. We live with Black folks in the states where people still practice racism and now have legal license to discriminate against folks. So the footnote here is that that's significant. There's now a law that says you cannot do that with regard to housing or with employment. Freudian slip, because you can still discriminate against people based on housing. And we still don't have access to what the law calls public accommodation. So I can be denied access to hotels, hospitals, restaurants, gas stations, all of the places that too many people take for granted that we should all have access to. And the irony of that is that we are having this conversation in June, which is Pride Month. I hate rainbows with a passion. In particular, I hate that any company that has ever seen my email address has now let me know that it is okay to be gay by sending a rainbow bat signal. And And I say this not because pride isn't important. It is important for people to be able to gather in community with people who look like them. And too often, Black folks cannot do that, right? We were bombed at Pulse nightclub on Latin night. Mother Bethel, our AME church in South Carolina, was bombed, right? I hosted a thriving summit of Black queer kids under the leadership of Barack Obama the weekend of the Pulse nightclub massacre, right? We don't have the ability to be safe. And we're having this conversation in Pride Month, typically when corporations trip over themselves to throw parties for gay white people, while at the same time, Black trans women are dying at a ridiculous rate. And Black queer people are being murdered, and we aren't talking about it. So many people know the name of George Floyd, and they should. Fewer people are saying the name of Breonna Taylor because of how misogyny works in our country, but they should. Some people are saying the name of Ahmaud Arbery, and they should. How many of y'all know what happened to Tony McDade, the Black trans man who was murdered by the police in Tallahassee less than 18 hours after having been the victim of a hate crime? Or Ayanna Dior, the Black trans woman who was beaten by grown Black boys. I say boys, not men, because men don't hit women, cis or trans, let alone jump them and film it on camera. Just last Friday, 2 other Black women, Dominique and Rhea, murdered, gruesome murders, right? And seldom do we talk about it because the twin evils of racism and homophobia are too much for people. It's too uncomfortable for them. And until we do more of this, and we trip up over pronouns and apologize when we misgender somebody, we will continue to not be free as a community. We will continue to struggle with regard to our physical well-being and our mental health. And we will otherwise resign to continue to live under the oppression of white supremacy and anti-Blackness.
Woo, Lord. I mean, you just like, okay, cut, no. But, you know, we need to hear that as a community because, you know, we were all kind of like nervous in a sense of not understanding all of the nuances and not wanting it to be disrespectful, but like literally like we need to understand what's going on because I didn't even realize until like last week that the rate of Black trans women specifically, not just trans women, but Black trans women being murdered it's like 10 times higher than like the national average. And that is just like ridiculous.
To say the least.
So I lead into that with Zaria. Can you share like, you know, I feel like I just want to understand what is it like to move in the world, especially as a corporate woman, to move in the world as a Black woman who happens to be trans in the middle of all this injustice. And then it's like, what does that feel like being, okay, there's all this racial oppression, but your life is in danger. And, you know, like share.
Sorry, before she answers, I want to offer some language. Okay. Because when we say who happens to be, it can diminish a significant part of who we are. And so I want to invite you to consider acknowledging that there are people who have trans experience. And so what does it mean to have trans experience? In the same way that there are Black folks who have Pan-African experience or Caribbean experience or experience because they have a disability.
Yeah, I totally receive that. And you know what, because I grew up with like my girlfriends that are in Baltimore that, you know, are trans Black women, and they would prefer to just be called a woman. So, you know, there are some folks that don't, right? And so this is also about acknowledging that as I'm looking at my screen and I see 4 Black women. You all might identify yourself in different ways, right? This is about us celebrating that there's always been diversity within among us. And that so much of what I want us all to do is appreciate, like all of us know what it's like to feel oppression. All of us know what it's like to have white people ask us questions that we've answered ad nauseum. All of us know what it's like to have to answer questions that people can Google. And so if we just start with that, we can build more. I'm sorry, sis, go ahead.
Thank you so much, David. That was such a powerful statement. Like it literally had me move back. And again, I guess to answer your first question about how do you guys get involved? And like David said before, it's about involving us and including us in spaces that we share, spaces that you occupy so that we can all come together and educate everyone else that may be watching or everyone else that's out there, just combining our audience and just sharing our knowledge, just having conversations like this. When it comes down to the corporate world, I would just say like it's been a lot. I'm 1 year and 6 months in transition. And so things have gotten a little bit easier as I've evolved in my transition, and I've you know, kind of, I don't know how to express it, but just kind of, you know, just step it up. Like, you know, I think it takes a lot to knock those doors down and really just let them know that I'm here and I'm in the room. But most importantly, it just takes that consistency of showing up. I know that there's a lot that surrounds that with showing up in safety or showing up and feeling like, you know, you're the only one there. But again, it's just something personally that I've had to work through. When we look at other races, like, you know, your Caucasian Americans and everyone else that's in the room that's occupying those spaces. And when I walk in the room, I have to make sure that I walk in set to go, you know, just the same way that I pulled up tonight in this conversation. I'm showing up in those spaces. And although I may feel a certain kind of way, I don't let that energy get the best of me, because I want to represent for those who are not there, and represent for those of my brothers and sisters, and give the people who are encountering me for the first time, you know, a wonderful experience. That way they can carry that same energy if they come across someone else. And so I really think that in the corporate world, for me, it's been a crazy experience, just by volunteering, again, showing up, getting myself associated with the National LGBTQ Task Force. That was a huge step for me that opened up a lot of doors. It's just been kind of one experience after the next, but really just showing up and just occupying those spaces and demanding the attention and demanding people listen to what I have to say. Like, you just have to continue with that momentum moving forward. You guys have to excuse me, I'm a little nervous, but.
And it's all women and then him, so I mean.
Well, you know, David just kind of came in and just shut it down.
But, be quiet.
I'm just clearing the way.
Zaria, when you say that you came in and you showed up and you wanted to make sure that you were representing for the people who weren't there, can you just share maybe the moments where you walked into that room? How are you able to mentally overcome maybe feeling that sense of awkwardness? Or was there ever a time where you felt a sense of judgment? Like, was there anything that maybe you told yourself? Because if there's someone who's listening who says, man, I identify with this completely and I'm scared to walk in these rooms and I don't know if I can walk in these rooms, maybe walk us through, like, what are some of those things that you've helped yourself to consistently show up and have that courage to do so? And I you know, and it shouldn't even be about having that courage, but the reality of where we're living and how people may treat you.
Well, for one, when I walk into a room and I occupy space, I always tell myself that I'm not less than anyone else that's going to be here or that's going to be in attendance. I've worked my ass off, excuse my language. I have worked very, very hard to become the person that I am, and I'm very proud of whom I am. And so that goes a long way in itself. Just knowing that when I step out my door every single day that I'm giving my best, I think that that's something to stand by, you know. A lot of us as African-American, women of color, African-American in general, our entire race, a lot of us aren't privileged enough to walk in mediocrity. And so, you know, for me, walking strong, walking with my head up, I don't belittle myself to begin with. I think that, you know, giving yourself that courage, taking that last look in the mirror before you enter a room, or taking that last look in the elevator, like, bitch, we got this, let's go, walk in, head up, heels high, let's go. You know, I think that, you know, we should all walk into those situations. But I will just say, going into like competitive cheer and gymnastics, that's really helped me in my professional life. It's helped me overall, because we went up against some of the most amazing teams around the world. And, you know, back in warm-ups, I remember as a little girl, just, you know, oh my gosh, we're going to get our asses beat, but we got to go give it. We have to give it all. We have to give it everything, because if we leave this on the floor, you know, that's going to carry us through. And a lot of times it did. And so a lot of times we kind of have to find that inner strength, and we have to encourage ourselves, and we have to support ourselves. And then once you get that reaction and that turnaround, when you walk through the door and you see everyone, you know, it just goes from there. You know, people give you what you give them. And so if you show up in your best, people are going to give you their best, you know? And so it's really about just feeling like you are everything. You're not inferior. We're not inferior. We are empowered. We have just as much as power as the next person. And so again, we have to continue to just show up in general, you know, and expect the best outcome. You can't walk in the room with negativity, because that's all you're going to receive if you do. So that's just kind of where we go from there.
I'm gonna use that. Now look, Dr. T, okay, you our show psychiatrist, you're the one with the medical degree. Like, can you give us an understanding of, like, what that oppression paradigm, and David, you kind of touched on it a bit with the whiteness and, you know, explain to us, like, how do we get oppressed and then feel like we gonna oppress somebody else inside of our own community?
Yeah. You know, I was thinking about something this week, because a mentor of mine who has now passed away, he used to say that Black people have the plantation mentality. So there's only a few spots at the top. So we have to fight each other because there's only a few of us who can do well, right? Because you were going to be the house, you know what, and you were going to get treated, you were still oppressed, you were still treated poorly, but it was better than the others. So the only way for us to differentiate ourselves, if we're going all the way back in history now, was to have this internal competitiveness and fighting. And so when we were in our own communities, you know, we tolerated each other. As David said, I think there was a lot of people not having the voice, accepting, but it was like people had to be in public, but in a closet at the same time, right? They could be Uncle so-and-so, but they also couldn't really be who they were. And so we've always had this competition. We've always had this setup for infighting. And we're trying, I think, more and more and more to understand each other. And I heard a lot in both of these conversations. We have talked a lot about self-care. And I also think about all the activists and how draining it is to always be fighting this fight. Now, as a Black person, you do that every day, but then you add on another layer. And so we've always been fighting this fight. We've always been struggling with each other. And now you add on all of these other layers. And it's like, how, I was wondering, as a sidetrack, I guess, how do you each take care of yourself, right? Because to do this work, you have to take care of yourself. I give a talk called Put Your Mask On First. If you don't take care of yourselves, you can't show up in the way that you just described, Zaria, right?
Yes.
So I think it would be helpful for people that, you know, to kind of hear a little bit about that from you. But then I also had this question, if you could help families, because if we know someone who's trans or LGBTQ plus, maybe we've had a conversation, but most of the time people don't know how to enter that conversation. If there's someone in their life that they want to get closer to, that they want to be authentic and have that person be authentic, but they don't know how to have that conversation and invite each other into that space. And so that is actually two trains of thought, and you can pick up on either.
Okay. Well, I would just say in reference to self-care. So something that I just experienced, you know, last week, or I think it was 2 weeks ago with the whole Ayanna Dior situation. And so prior to that, you know, we're, you know, going hard in the Black Lives Movement, everything like that. And then you see simultaneously Ayanna Dior situation pop up in the midst of that. And then not only that, 2 other trans sisters just in recency, just as well as Tony McDade. So for me, I had to totally decompress. I had to totally, you know, take a break, step back for a couple of days, gather my energy and spirits back together. You know, I always want to show up in my best person and my best self. And so for me, it's all about giving the best that I can. And I know that if I'm not 100%, I'm not going to show up halfway. You know what I mean? Because that can really affect someone tremendously when you are just giving it halfway. So my best advice in that situation there in reference to self-care is if you are not occupying or functioning at 100%, you know, do what you need to do. Take a step back. You know, social media can be a huge sensory overload. And so sometimes you have to sit down, take a break, cool off. You know, sometimes in situations you immediately want to get upset and you immediately want to react. But sometimes you have to sit down with yourself and have a conversation with yourself, you know, before you actually go out and express, because you never know the other side of the story, what's going on. You never know if you were triggered in the moment based on what happened. And so you just want to really just sit down and just really analyze everything, you know, walk it off and then come back to the situation and address it later. In regards to having conversations with other people of trans or other people of the LGBTQ plus community, I always just say, start off, you know, if you want to get closer to that person, you can start off very general. You don't have to go head in. You don't have to go, you know, shoulders forward or blasting, and just ask a simple question. How are you? You know, what are you up to? What are your goals? What do you hope to pursue in life? Where do you think where are you in the next 5 years? You know, and so I think that a lot of times people try to overcomplex the situation, and you overthink it, you overanalyze it, and you find yourself in an awkward space. And so for me, we are looking at each other as equals. We're fighting for equality. And so the same way you would want to be addressed professionally, or, you know, if the same way you would want someone openly or invite you into a conversation, that's the same way we feel as well, you know. And just like I'm right now sitting here just honored to be included in this conversation specifically, you know, it's the same for a lot of other women out there that just want their voice to be heard. And a lot of other LGBTQ plus members, you'll find that there's a range or a spectrum of what everyone's thought processes and beliefs are. And so when you're looking at that one particular person in general, just ask simple questions. How are you? How's your day going? You know, what's going on? What are you up to? What's new? You know, and go from there. It's a simple conversation. So just, yeah, to make a long story short, just be general, you know, don't be weird about it.
How about that? Don't be weird, period. I mentioned this earlier. I'm from Inglewood, California, born and raised. My parents are from Austin, Texas. And I grew up being required to address women by calling them ma'am. And I, over the course of my life, as I moved throughout this country and sometimes around the world, have appreciated that there are certain times where that term is received as a sign of endearment. And somebody might say, oh, baby, bless your heart. There are times where a Black woman will say to me, are you trying to call me old? And it's a very different feeling. And I say this again to offer an example of this really being about us appreciating that, to my sister Zaria's point, we sometimes get in our way overthinking shit. I taught kindergarten and third grade, and I miss being around children because not only do they not engage in the politics of respectability, but they don't have time for platitudes. They ask questions because they're curious and they want to know. And they're often really seeking to just build with people. And so I think specific to your question, Dr. T, around what families can do, it's three things. One is, so much of what the research shows is that Black folks in particular who have a hard time making space for and loving on people in their community who are queer, it is because they fear for their safety. And that fear is a logical extension that grows out of the fear that comes from knowing that to be Black in America, to have skin that is kissed by the sun, is to already be exposed to violence. And so if you add on something else to that, to have a disability, whether it be hidden or visible, to not have English be your first language, to be queer in some other way. And again, I want to acknowledge that queer in America and Black is a double redundancy. To be Black is to be queer, right? And so to add on these additional forms of layer and oppression means that folks are taking on even more, right? This is even acknowledging Dr. Joy DeGruy's work around epigenetics and the fact that we carry trauma that we've inherited, right? And so if you know somebody and you're concerned about their safety and they're especially a member of your family, you should already have a relationship with them based on love. Their sexual identity, just like their sexual history or their credit score, shouldn't really matter because you should already be in community with them and the anchor should be love. Such that if you have a conversation and you say the wrong word, ain't nobody gonna be mad because it's all love. Such that if you ask a question that you maybe shouldn't ask or is a little inappropriate, they'll tell you, that's too much, back up, in love. And if you don't have that kind of a relationship, I'm gonna say to you the same thing that I say to white folks, which is that it's your fault. There's so many white people, well-meaning white people, who have tripped over themselves in the last month. Not even, we still not through Pride Month. Trip over themselves to ask, what can I do? How can I not be a racist? And the thought that I literally have is twofold. One, why do you consult people in moments of pain? Mm-hmm. For your personal benefit, right? Some of this is about people needing to sit with their own discomfort and to ask themselves some of these questions. Why don't I have more friends who identify as having trans experience? Why don't I have friends who are living with HIV? Why don't I have friends who are whatever, fill in the blank, right? That is our personal responsibility. And we should all do a better job of leaning in love and not letting the stereotypes and ignorance that is often wrapped up in social identities get in the way. To shift for a second, if you don't have a relationship with somebody, demonstrate that you are compassionate and a little bit competent. I say a little bit competent because when I was young and I didn't know something, my mother would say to me, look it up. And I had to go find an encyclopedia and literally look it up. Most of the questions that people ask about base level identity stuff, you can Google. People have written books about it. There are podcasts, there are videos, there's all kinds of stuff that people can indulge in, right? Beyond that, when you engage in somebody in real time, don't make assumptions about people based on your expectations and stereotypes. Ask somebody what their pronouns are. Ask somebody what their name is. Doing things that, again, allow us to build and to disagree and to argue and to correct is how we develop relationships. And I really want Black people, as we are holding white people accountable, I'm saying every white person I know, it's not enough for you to tell me that you're not a racist. I need a receipt. I want to watch you demonstrate what it means to be an anti-racist. And I want the same for Black people too. That is us having these kind of conversations, investing in these kind of ways, and making space for Black queer people to take up space in ways that we always do, but it's simply not acknowledged in other venues.
I want to draw to your point of, two things and making a comment. One is about the discomfort that I think we even need to reflect on within ourselves, within our own community. And then when you think about the simple things of just asking a question, and I give the example of my daughter who is 7, maybe about last year. So she was 6, we were in the store grade. And she basically saw someone who was transitioning and she asked, are you a boy or a girl? And my own discomfort made me feel like
shut it down,
embarrassed, and it wasn't that I had an issue with the person, but it was that I just felt awkward. I didn't know, and you would think most people wouldn't have an issue with the child's innocence. Some people may, but it was like how children simply ask the question. And and so I say that as a reflection for all of us who at times don't acknowledge our own discomfort or our own stereotypes because of our own ignorance. And we just, and so those are the things that, just as an example of things that we have to start to take a look at and in reading more and understanding more, like you said, and Googling more, and in knowing, like, in that moment, that could have been a lesson. But instead I was just like, shh, like.
It was a lesson. It was a lesson. It was a lesson. You taught the baby in that moment that it's not okay to ask those questions. It was a powerful lesson. Right. And the opportunity is to reflect on that and think about how we could shift and invite space for babies to ask those kinds of things.
Well, I think that when it comes down to the whole misgendering topic or just asking a question for clarity, me personally, I've always said at the beginning of my transition, I said, you know what, to avoid situations like that, I'm not going to put myself in those situations. So I'm not going to go to the grocery store looking crazy. I'm not going to go to the grocery store if I am in transition to become a woman. And that is my main goal, and I know that there are some things that I can do to kind of achieve the look that I want to achieve so that I am not in those situations. I don't step out of my house, not in my best. You get what I'm saying? And it really just goes back to there. So I personally don't think that your child was wrong for asking that question, because there is innocence there in that question. She didn't know, and she wanted clarity, and in that moment, it's nothing really to be, I personally don't think that it's nothing to be embarrassed or anything about just in that matter, just because 1, it's a child, 2, and in that moment in time, like, it's kind of like, at what age do I teach my children these things? You know what I mean? And so.
Well, I think it's the fear of, how is the question going to be because you don't know. Some people may say, I am this or I am that. Right. And then, but for me, it was a natural reaction of fear of, is this person going to be receptive to what she's saying? Even though, because again, I say, even though it's a child, it doesn't, sometimes it doesn't matter. Offense is offense, depending on who the person is.
Or what happened to them that day.
For that part, they just looked and they didn't say anything, and my daughter didn't ask anything else, but so they didn't acknowledge her question, and I just kind of stood. I didn't know what to say either, because I didn't want to just openly have the discussion, because I wasn't sure if that was appropriate, I think. So, and that is where
And appropriate is relative. The thing that I want to hold on to in this moment is that there's an opportunity for all of us still in this moment to have a conversation about the fact that the answer to that question is often never really either or, it's both and, right? Like I have a mentor that says we should be not beholden to the tyranny of either or, but liberated by the beauty of both and. And the reality is that we don't teach children that gender is assigned at birth, that a doctor makes an assignment of gender. And most often doctors do that based on boy or girl. Sometimes doctors cannot make an assignment, and what they write on the birth certificate is intersex. What we also don't talk about is that if a doctor makes an assignment and one lives their life or has an experience that is consistent, they're cis. If one doesn't, then they are trans. Even just having that level of the conversation that goes beyond, right, an X chromosome meets an X chromosome, and then there's a girl, X chromosome meets a Y chromosome, then there's a boy. There are at least 3 other genetic permutations that are possible that we don't even talk about. And so my point is, I want us to get past that. It's a visceral response. I get everything you're saying. And I want everybody to be clear. I love children. I don't think that they can ask a wrong question. I think often that I tell adults, be careful what you ask them because they're going to give you a real honest answer, right? I want us to get beyond how we are uncomfortable by the fact that there's a lot that we don't know so that we can talk more, so that we can argue better.
Yeah, I think we also have to be honest that, as Zaria said, as Black people in general, but certainly Black people in any kind of professional setting and even non-professional setting, working class, whatever, we know from jump that we have to show up 8 steps ahead of the game. And so to put yourself in a position where at the same time you're being vulnerable and you're trying to present your best self, because to connect with another person, whether they're cis or trans or whatever, it creates a vulnerability. And so people, I think, are trying to figure out in their own minds, how do we, bridge this chasm where I'm trying to be my very best, but I want to open up a space where I can get to know you and you can get to know me. And it's difficult. And so that's why there's awkwardness. That's why people avoid, because they don't know how to bridge that chasm of their own feelings, their own issues, while trying to figure out, how do I get to know this person who may or may not be like me, at least in my mind. And so there's like this whole mental gymnastics that's going on. And while we can say it's simple, let's just treat each other, I always say compassion and grace. But as Black people, we have so much that we're balancing mentally and emotionally at any given time. Our ability to connect with each other is impaired by that degree of magnitude that's going on in our minds.
Yeah, I agree. And I want to say just one point to what none of this is easy. I even acknowledge when I talk about the acronym that it requires work. I want to be clear about that this requires work. It requires a constant commitment to it, right? And I also think that there's danger. I think one of the ways that white supremacy wins is by having us buy into this notion that we have to work twice as hard to get half as far as mediocre white people. When we show up at our worst, we still do better than most of them. And so a part of what I want to come out of this, Dr. T, to your point, is us making space for us to move all of that preoccupation out of our heads so we can do a better job of being in relationship with each other.
Absolutely.
Can we just quickly talk, and then, because I know I'm watching the clock here, I know Sasha's looking at the clock, but can we talk about the role of, because church is such a big part of the Black experience, period, right? Whether you're Muslim or you're Christian, churches are like core foundation for many or most of us. So can we talk about how does that impact then this ability to seek understanding? I had this conversation with one of my very good friends, and she gave me this eye opener of church is about, they tell you touch and agree, right? Agreement, not necessarily touch and understand the other person. So how do we need, or can we start to transform our church and our own sense of religiosity to help expand this conversation and to find that compassion for each other?
Sis.
Me or?
I take up a lot of space, go for it.
I think when it comes down to religion, I'm going to be honest, I was not brought up in the church. We would go to church and celebrate holidays like Easter, or, you know, every once in a while we would go. When I got to maybe my teens, I kind of had a large disconnect for it because I kind of saw a lot of contradictions of people in the church that, you know, praise and worship, and then, you know, after 9 p.m. when the sun goes down, you know, they're sipping their drinks and it's getting crazy. And so for me personally, you know, my parents brought us up to treat people as you would want to be treated. And so, you know, again, it just really, that in itself just goes so far. To treat someone with respect that you may not know, you treat everyone with the same respect. There should not be a change from one person to the next. That respect should go all the way 100%, whether you know or not, whether you informed or not. And so I guess when it just comes down to that, I just always fall back to treat people as if you want to be treated, no matter what the situation is. You know, it could be a homeless person on the street. It could be anyone, you know, hi, how are you? Thank you so much, you know, and just, again, I personally just keep things simple when it comes down to it. And it gets me very, very, very far. And so to have that church upbringing, that's something that I can't 100% answer on. But again, I just fall back on having manners and respect for the next person. We are all equals, and we must look at each other as equals. And again, it just goes so far.
I am the grandson of a Baptist preacher who transitioned in January, but who carried a Bible as well as a gun because he's a Black man from Texas. And I grew up knowing beyond a shadow of a doubt that I, in my fullness, in my Blackness, and now in my queerness, was beautifully and wonderfully made. And that the price for all that I am purposed to do has already been paid. I say that because often when we have conversations about Black queer experiences in the church, we lean too much into the pain and fail to appreciate that for so many of us, that's this place where we learn to take up space and to speak full truth to power and to experience the kind of joy that a whole lot of people go out of their ways for to get close to when they want to be around us. And I also celebrate that the National Black Justice Coalition is in partnership with faith leaders around this country who are affirming, who are Black and queer, who are not, but who understand that the Jesus I know in the Bible that I read as a child who went to church sometimes 3 times a week at a minimum is one who always showed up in love for the least of these without judging and always attempting to make sure that people felt whole. And so my hope is that whether it's Black churches or HBCUs, or legacy civil rights organizations, or Black Greek organizations, I'm a member of Kappa Alpha Psi Fraternity Incorporated, that we ensure that all of our institutions, all the places that Black people have the ability to move through, make space for all of us to show up in our fullness and be loved.
We didn't know you was a Kappa, David. Hold up. Z-side.
These baby hairs didn't tell you? I'm silly stuff.
Dr. T, I guess as we begin to close out, can you jump in here and just talk about, from the mental standpoint, you have oftentimes when these tragedies that continue to take place, we've talked about how our mental health is impacted, and we've never quite focused on the tragedies that are taking place within the LGBTQ plus community, and or even the fact that there is a fear amongst living in that community and the things that are happening. When you have someone, or you've had a client who is dealing with, how they identify or how they're perceived in the world in general, when you take it beyond just being Black, what are some things that we can look at from a psychology standpoint of helping our brothers and sisters who may be dealing with that, who can't talk to their family, who may not have somebody who's willing to have the conversation?
I mean, I think Zaria started out with a really great suggestion, is to learn to listen to your own body and to learn when you need to let yourself fill up before you can try to give out or to go out and do whatever you're trying to do. So learning to listen to yourself and your own needs is going to be one of the best ways that you can take care of yourself. If you don't have people in your life, in your family, in your biological family, many people in the LGBTQ plus community, they are way more better than the rest of us at creating a sense of family and community, somewhat, I think, out of necessity. because they haven't always felt accepted by their biological families. And so in many cities across America, there are places and spaces where you can find support, where you can find people who are willing to commune with you and help you love yourself and build up yourself and take care of yourself while you figure out whatever's going on, and then even figure out what you want to do. You know, like there are just so many different spaces where you can get support in that. And if you don't know where those places are in your community, then like David said, Google them, right? Most people these days are on some kind of social media and you can find support. Now, I always tell people be careful on the internet because you never know the caliber or the quality or things like that. But
we might get a dick pic.
We can always find support if we're willing to look for it. And hopefully, you know, everyone will have someone in their lives that they can talk to, that they can feel embraced by, that they can feel loved by, whether that's born family or surrounded family that develops over time. So really learning to take care of yourself starts with listening to yourself and not pushing yourself beyond what you're comfortable for someone else's gain. So you're trying to show up and you're trying to be what you think they want you to be instead of being who you are. And that's never going to turn out good. So the first step for anyone, LGBTQ plus or anything else, is to learn to listen to yourself, to learn to respect yourself, to learn to appreciate yourself, and then find sources of support in whatever way you can so you can begin to build yourself if you don't have that kind of environment in your home.
Star, what say you with just, well, you know, we're doing this backwards. We always start with the guests. Zaria and then David, if you could just kind of close us out. If there's anything that you will want anyone to know, anything you just want to leave the show with as we move forward and progressing and having these types of conversations and dialogue that is very much needed, what would you leave us with, Zaria?
Well, first I would just say, or first and last, to say I would just really, I guess when I'm looking at building someone or building self-esteem or building confidence or building anything to go towards a goal, I would just say first and foremost, start with setting a goal for yourself. And then you have to set realistic steps to where you are in life to realistically walk yourself in life to achieve those goals. And, you know, in steps so that you can feel a sense of accomplishment, you know, so you can take some positivity out of the situation. And then that leads me into my second point is to, a lot of us focus on so much of the negative that's going on, and we forget the beautiful things about being who you are or being open or being out or being free. And again, like David mentioned, these are also things that we take for granted. You know, it takes people a long time to feel comfortable with themselves. And when you get to a point where you've established what you want and who you are and what makes you happy, I think that that's something that you have to hold on to and continue to build forward. And so again, to shape and change your narrative, you have to focus on pulling what's positive out of that situation rather than focusing on what's going to make you nervous or what you're scared of or, you know, what other people may think. You just have to focus on what makes you happy. If it truly makes you happy, then continue to pursue that and continue to elevate yourself and find growth, or continue to elevate yourself in whatever it is that you're doing in order to achieve those goals. Once you achieve them, then you have to continue to set further goals and continue moving forward in life. Otherwise, you're going to get stagnant. Otherwise, you're going to get lost. Otherwise, you're never going to feel fulfilled. And so, again, it's just the simplicity in the situation. So just focus on the positive things. There's a lot of positive aspects in walks of life when it comes down to transitioning. LGBTQ+, being African-American, holding important spaces and important rooms, and share that knowledge and share that wealth and build someone else up, you know, in the process. So it's about just sharing and caring.
David?
And thank you, David.
No, sister, thank you. I am, it's taken me a minute because I'm in my feelings. Real men cry. I will tell my kids that, my students. Real men also wear pink. But I am in this moment processing what it means for you as a Black woman who has come into being a Black woman in such a unique way. Every question that you've been asked where you could be justified in identifying how much weight you carry by yourself, how often you've had to do things in isolation, like, and in spite of all of that, you were graceful and committed to being better than most people have to be, including the current occupant of the Oval Office. And the way that you show up is the way that I know all of my sisters to show up. So I'm not surprised. I am struggling to ask myself as a Black man, a Black cis man, a Black cis hetero, I'm not, same gender loving man.
He saw all these pretty girls. It was like,
well, listen, that's a whole nother. I'm gonna come back to that, right? So stop, Star, because you're about to get me in trouble. I'm gonna come back to that. That's gonna be my third point. My first point is just to say thank you, my sisters, Black women, comma, cis and trans, because we need to do that, for just being you and showing up in the way in which you always show up. That is not lost on me. Y'all always hold space for us. Literally in this moment, I was looking at my phone, in part because Essence is hosting a Dear Black Men, We Love You virtual summit. And I'm on there talking about mental health with Jeff Johnson, right? But again, like, Black women holding us up even when we don't deserve it. So that's one. The second thing that I want to highlight is the importance of guarding your joy. Dr. T, you said this. I find myself every day replaying the video that all of us who have flown take for granted, which is that in case of an emergency, oxygen mask gonna fall from the ceiling, put yours on and secure yours first before you tend to anybody else. And what I know is that Black people, Black women and girls in particular, I'll end where I started, can never do that. Mm-hmm. Y'all will secure, I won't even get with the graphics, but y'all will secure everybody else's masks before you secure your own. And in this moment in particular, because there are so many of us dealing with isolation and feelings around hopelessness and the economic crisis on top of the mental health crisis, right? Like, everything is just bad now. I worry so much about us not attending to our wellness. Mm-hmm. And if you don't do anything, again, acknowledging that this is complicated, it takes a whole lot of work. You got to learn some new language. You got to be uncomfortable. The Latin root of the word education is educare. It means to draw out. The process is difficult by design. If you do nothing else but tend to your wellness in this moment, then I'll be good. Semicolon, last point. So many of us, unless you show up in the world like me, like Zaria, where I have the kind of life now where you can read my bio and assume things about my sexual identity, my gender orientation, my expression. The vast majority of people, 99.9% of people, get to do whatever they want with whomever they want, however they want, as often as they want, without ever having to identify, check a box, join a committee, or do any of the kind of things that are required because of how white supremacy, anti-Blackness, and homophobia, transphobia, transmisogynoir, the term created to talk about how all of that works in the lives of Black women, exists. And so I'm saying this because, Star, let's be clear. I have dated and loved Black women intimately. And that is to be stated and understood, as I say in this moment, that I'm also a very proud same gender loving man. And I know that that's going to fuck up some people's complication because they just like, that don't add up. People and identity and development is fluid and it changes. And it's often based in context. That's the experience of Black people more generally. And so I'm asking for us to give each other grace, if only because there are a generation of young people who are trying to figure this out, right? And so more than 70% of kids in high school today identify as anything other than strictly heterosexual. To be clear, that is not because there's a gay agenda. If there is a gay agenda, I want to see it. I want the cliff notes, the bibliography. I'm not about duplicating efforts. That is an indication of young people who are woke and conscious and have benefited from all of the struggles that have come before them, saying these boxes, these categories, these binaries, this flattening, boy, girl, pink, blue, it just doesn't work. And they are demanding that we do better. That is why there are children, literal children, who are risking their lives to protest in a global pandemic right now. And we have to be clear, not only about the implications of that, right, Dr. T? I worry about physiologically what that does to children to have to protest. There's a video right now of a 17-year-old Black girl who said to Ali Velshi that she was willing to risk it all in violation of protest. I'll go to jail. I'll be exposed to COVID. I will die so my babies don't have to deal with this. This is us getting in our way. This is us not loving on each other as Black folks. This is us saying that we love Black people when we really only mean Black people who look like us and show up in the world in ways that affirm us. And Fannie Lou Hamer, again, the Black feminist in me, said a long time ago, unless and until all of us are free, none of us are going to be free. And so I want us to do the work required to be well, so that if we can't do this, our babies can be free, because I've never met a child that asked to be born. And if we love them and we do this right, then we can ensure that they will be well.
I'm just gonna keep my closing to simple tonight and say that I want to remind us all to walk in compassion and grace. If we don't know what each other has been through, and I do believe at the core that most people want to do better. Most people want to connect. We actually have a pandemic going on in this country that we don't talk about, and that's isolation and loneliness. And that is just as deadly as the coronavirus. And so in general, I think people want to figure out how to connect, but it's awkward, it's scary, it requires you to be vulnerable. And so if we all just treat each other with compassion and grace, then we can get a lot further with connecting with each other, with bonding with each other, and with building each other up.
Okay, I got my two things, but I'll be brief. I always have two things. So, and before that, I think David was flirting with me, but that's all right. That'll be awkward. So, my two things are gratitude. One, thank you for showing up. Both of our guests showing up whole and ready to have the conversation, and having grace with us around, us just not being comfortable, not knowing what to say, but allowing us that space to ask those questions, because that can be daunting, because I don't like people asking me questions about all of Black humanity. So I appreciate that, and that's gratitude. And then the second and the last thing is just the self-inquiry piece. David, you brought up about, asking yourself, why am I uncomfortable with this? Why did that trigger X, Y, or Z with me? And being open to self-inquiry and seeing ourselves and some of our own biases. So that's something I'm definitely going to take home and as my homework. So, and thank you.
I definitely want to second everything that's been expressed. I think this has been a great start into many of the conversations that we need to have. I think my takeaway overall would just be, the same sentiment as Star saying, that self-inquiry, owning your own personal work that needs to be done, as well as honoring the people who are around you. So I received this conversation. I think this was an incredible conversation, and I honor all of you who've joined us today. Thank you so much. We really appreciate it. And we out.